Tonight is a very special night. It's the last stop of our tour, and it's the last show for Genesis.
Phil Collins can no longer grip drumsticks with his trembling hands, and his heartbroken son just made a devastating announcement that's leaving fans worldwide in tears.
We auditioned, and I really didn't want to be the singer. I really didn't want to be the singer.
The legendary Genesis drummer who once electrified millions with thunderous beats now sits helplessly in a chair, watching his child take his place behind the kit. What did his son reveal that shocked everyone? Will Phil ever play again? Join us as we find out what Phil Collins' son said that has left fans in tears. When a legend can't hold his sticks, the hands that once thundered across drum kits for millions of fans now shake when they try to hold a simple pair of drumsticks. Phil Collins sits in his chair backstage, watching his son Nick warm up behind the Genesis drum kit. The same kit that Phil spent decades creating the sounds that defined an entire generation. But those days are gone forever. At 73, the man who gave us In the Air Tonight and Against All Odds can barely grip anything without help. The decline started years ago, but fans didn't see it coming. Phil had always been an energetic performer who could sing and drum at the same time. He was the guy who flew across the Atlantic in one day to perform at both Live Aid concerts. He seemed unstoppable. Then his body began to betray him. In 2016, doctors tried to fix his spine through surgery. Phil hoped it would give him back his music. Instead, it left him unable to use his left hand properly. The surgery that was supposed to save his career ended up ending it. The hardest part wasn't losing his ability to play. It was watching his son step into his place. Nick Collins had grown up around music, but he never expected to take over his father's role so soon. During Genesis's final tour, fans watched as the young drummer sat behind the kit while his legendary father sang from a chair at the front of the stage. Phil tried to smile and engage with the crowd, but everyone could see the sadness in his eyes. For a man who built his entire identity around being both singer and drummer, losing half of that identity felt like losing himself. But there was something else. Anyone could see a father who's proud that his son can carry on the musical legacy, even though it breaks his heart that he can't be part of it anymore. The Collins name will continue to make music, but the original Collins behind the drums is now just a memory. To understand the full weight of what Phil has lost, we need to see just how high he climbed. How did a small boy from West London become one of music's biggest legends? The making of a music legend. Phil Collins didn't start life planning to be a superstar. He was just a regular kid growing up in West London, with parents who noticed he had rhythm. At 5 years old, while other children played with toys, Phil was already behind a drum kit. His tiny hands could barely hold the sticks, but something magical happened when he played. The beat came naturally to him, like breathing. His parents saw potential beyond music. They enrolled him in drama school, where Phil discovered he could act too. By age 13, he landed the role that would change everything. Playing the Artful Dodger in the West End production of Oliver was Phil's first taste of performing for big crowds. Night after night, he stood on that stage, feeling the energy of hundreds of people watching him. The spotlight felt like home. But as Phil grew older, he faced a choice. Acting was going well, but music kept calling to him. The drums felt like an extension of his soul. In 1970, when he was just 19, he made a decision that would shape music history. He auditioned for a band called Genesis and became their drummer. Genesis was different back then. They were experimental, complex, and led by a theatrical singer named Peter Gabriel. Phil was happy being the guy in the back, keeping the rhythm while Gabriel commanded the front of the stage. Phil never wanted to be the front man. He was perfectly content being the heartbeat of the band. Then, in 1975, everything changed. Peter Gabriel decided to leave Genesis. The band was lost without their leader. They tried finding new singers, but nobody felt right. Phil had been singing backup vocals for years, so during rehearsals, he would sing the songs to help the potential new singers learn them. The other band members started to notice something. Phil's voice wasn't just good, it was special. It had emotion, power, and a vulnerability that connected with people. Slowly, they realized their drummer had been hiding a secret weapon all along. Phil Collins became the new lead singer of Genesis, still playing drums when he could. The late 1970s saw Genesis transform under Phil's leadership. They became more accessible while keeping their musical complexity. But Phil had even bigger dreams brewing. In 1981, he released his first solo album, Face Value. The songs came from his heart, dealing with his painful divorce and personal struggles. Fans heard something raw and honest in his voice. Then came the 1980s, and Phil Collins exploded into superstardom. His signature sound, that booming, echoing drum effect called gated reverb, became the soundtrack of the decade. Songs like In the Air Tonight and Against All Odds dominated radio stations around the world. Phil had more #1 hits during the 80s than any other artist. He was everywhere. The numbers tell an incredible story. Phil sold over 150 million records worldwide. He joined an exclusive club with only Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson, artists who sold over 100 million records, both as solo performers and as band members. 8 Grammy Awards, an Oscar, Golden Globes, and inductions into multiple halls of fame followed. Phil Collins had climbed to the very top of the music world. He was a global icon whose voice and drums had touched millions of lives. But success this massive always comes with a price. And for Phil, that price would eventually become too heavy to bear. But even legends aren't immune to the passage of time. And Phil's body was about to send him a devastating message. What happens when a warrior's greatest weapon turns against him? A warrior's battle against time. The first warning came in 2007, during what should have been a triumphant Genesis reunion tour. Phil felt a sharp pain shoot through his neck and down his spine. He tried to ignore it, pushing through the discomfort like he always had. But this wasn't just tired muscles or tour fatigue. This was his body telling him that decades of hunching over drum kits had finally caught up with him. The diagnosis was devastating. Phil's vertebrae were literally crushing his spinal cord. Years of leaning forward, arms extended, shoulders hunched, the exact position every drummer knows by heart, had slowly destroyed his spine. The very posture that made him famous was killing his ability to perform. Phil refused to give up. He started taping drumsticks to his hands just to get through concerts. Fans cheering in the audience had no idea their hero was fighting excruciating pain with every beat. Between songs, Phil would flex his fingers, trying to restore feeling to his hands. The tape left marks on his skin, but it was the only way he could hold on to his sticks. By 2010, the physical pain had become emotional torture. Phil found himself sinking into a depression deeper than any he had ever experienced. The man who had lifted millions of people with his music couldn't lift himself out of bed some days. He admitted later that he had even thought about ending his life, but stopped himself when he thought about his children. They needed their father, even if he felt broken. The emotional pain led to another dangerous path. After his third divorce and retirement from touring, Phil started drinking heavily. Alcohol became his escape from the constant physical discomfort and the emptiness of not performing. Days blended together in a haze of television and bottles. He was slowly destroying himself from the inside while his body crumbled from the outside. In 2016, Phil decided to fight back. He underwent spinal surgery, hoping doctors could repair the damage and give him back his music. The surgery was supposed to be his salvation. Instead, it became another crushing blow. When Phil woke up, he discovered he could no longer use his left hand properly. The surgery had saved him from worse damage, but it had also ended his drumming career forever. Recovery became Phil's new full-time job. He had to learn to walk with a cane, to accept help with simple tasks, and to find hope without the thing that had defined him for 50 years. The alcohol had to go too. Phil committed to sobriety, and slowly, day by day, he climbed out of that dark hole. 3 years without drinking became a victory he celebrated quietly, but his body wasn't finished testing him. In 2017, a condition called foot drop, a side effect of his back surgery, caused him to fall in his hotel room. Phil hit his head on a chair, opening a deep gash near his eye that required stitches. The fall was a reminder that his balance, his coordination, and his basic mobility were all compromised. Then came the diabetes diagnosis. Phil's body was attacking itself on multiple fronts now. An abscess formed on his foot and became dangerously infected. He needed treatment in a hyperbaric chamber, breathing pure oxygen under pressure to help his body heal. Each medical crisis felt like another door closing on the active life he once knew. The man who once flew across the Atlantic to perform twice in one day now needed help getting dressed. The hands that created some of music's most memorable moments could barely hold a coffee cup. Phil's battle wasn't just against time. It was against the loss of identity that comes when your body can no longer do what your heart desires most. And watching it all unfold were the people who loved him most. His children, who would soon face an impossible choice. As Phil's body failed him, his greatest fear wasn't losing his career. It was watching his children step into roles they never asked for. How do you replace a legend when that legend is your own father? The next generation steps forward. Nick Collins never planned to become Genesis's drummer. Growing up, he watched his father create magic behind those drums, but he wanted to find his own path in music. Nick formed his own band, Better Strangers, determined to prove he could succeed without riding on the Collins name. He wrote songs, booked gigs, and worked to build something that belongs entirely to him. But life had different plans. During Genesis's final tour in 2022, Phil sat at the front of the stage in a chair, his voice still strong but his hands unable to grip drumsticks. Behind him, his 21-year-old son Nick powered through the same songs Phil had been playing for decades. The contrast was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. Fans could see the pride in Phil's eyes every time he glanced back at his son. But they could also see the sadness of a man watching someone else live his dream. The 5 years before that final tour had been precious for both father and son. They traveled together across the United States and United Kingdom, performing in sold-out arenas. Phil was still able to play some drums then, and those shared stages became their bonding time. Music was their common language, the thing that connected them beyond typical father-son conversations. Nick learned more than drumming techniques during those years. He watched his father handle pressure, connect with audiences, and maintain professionalism even when his body was betraying him. Phil never complained during performances, never let fans see his pain. Nick absorbed those lessons about dignity and dedication. Now, with Genesis officially finished, Nick faces the challenge of stepping out of his father's shadow while honoring what Phil built. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Lily Collins has been fighting her own battle with legacy and identity. Her success as an actress, particularly starring in Emily in Paris, brought inevitable comparisons to her famous father. Critics and fans alike questioned whether she earned her roles through talent or family connections. Lily has always been honest about the complicated relationship she had with her father growing up. Phil's touring schedule meant he was often absent during her childhood, leaving her feeling abandoned and resentful. Those feelings created distance between them for years, even as she pursued her own career in entertainment. But watching her father's health decline changed everything for Lily. She began to understand the cost of his success, not just to his body, but to his relationships with his children. The anger she had carried for years transformed into compassion and a desire to rebuild their connection. In March 2022, Lily attended Genesis's final performance, watching her brother behind the drums and her father at the microphone. 3 generations of Collins' talent were represented that night: Phil's legacy, Nick's present, and Lily's own artistic journey influenced by growing up in a creative household. Both Nick and Lily now find themselves in the unique position of supporting their father through his darkest period while building their own careers. What comes next? By the early 2000s, something had shifted in how people saw Phil Collins. The same voice that had comforted millions through heartbreak was now being called annoying. The drumming that had defined a generation was labeled as overproduced. Phil had become so successful, so present in popular culture, that people began to resent him for it. The criticism came from everywhere. Music journalists wrote harsh reviews. Fellow musicians made cutting comments in interviews. The Gallagher brothers from Oasis publicly mocked his music, calling it boring and claiming it was time for real artists to take over. Even David Bowie dismissed some of his own 1980s work by calling it his Phil Collins period, as if collaborating with Phil had been a mistake. The attacks became personal. Critics didn't just dislike his music. They seemed to dislike him as a person. They called him smug, bland, and out of touch. Old stories about his divorces were brought up repeatedly, often with cruel jokes attached. Phil found himself becoming a punchline instead of a respected artist. The worst part was that Phil began to believe some of it. He started looking back at old performances and interviews, cringing at what he saw. He admitted he had been everywhere in the 1980s, on radio, television, in movies, at charity events. His face and voice had saturated popular culture to the point where people couldn't escape him even if they wanted to. Phil retreated from the spotlight, but the damage to his reputation felt permanent. The man who had once been called pop's nice guy was now seen as a symbol of everything wrong with mainstream music. It was during this period of public rejection that his personal life began falling apart too, his health declining, his marriages ending, his drinking increasing. But his children saw something the critics missed. They saw a father who had worked himself to the breaking point to provide for his family and give joy to others. Nick and Lily watched their dad endure years of mockery while his body was already failing him. They decided the world needed to remember who Phil Collins really was. When Genesis announced their final reunion tour in 2020, it felt like a chance for redemption. Phil would get one last opportunity to share the stage with his original bandmates and show audiences what they had meant to him. But even this farewell tour was cursed with problems. COVID-19 forced postponements and cancellations. Phil's health continued to deteriorate. What should have been a celebration became a struggle just to reach the finish line. That final show was heartbreaking and triumphant at the same time. 3 generations of Collins' creativity were represented: Phil's legacy, Nick's present talent, and the promise of what comes next. Phil's body may have failed him, but his children's love never did. And in that love, the Collins legacy found its true meaning, not in record sales or awards, but in the bonds that music had helped create and ultimately strengthen between a father and his children. Will Nick Collins ever be able to step out of his father's shadow and prove he's more than just a legendary name? As Phil Collins faces his final years watching his children carry on his musical legacy, what do you think hurts more? Losing his ability to play, or knowing his kids had to sacrifice their own dreams to keep his alive? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.